Starting all over. Starting all over. This is the second time I've done this video. I might have to do this video 17 times. I don't care. I don't care if it takes all freaking night. I'm going to keep going and keep going until this video is done. Why? Why did I have to stop? Well, the reason I had to stop was because as we're working here with Blender 2.9, I bumped into something where I just had a complete stupid attack and didn't actually know what I was doing, and I'm just like wasting your time babbling on and on about nothing, trying to find my way around the interface. So the whole point of this video is to reiterate for myself how the freaking interface works, okay? And you're going to learn a ton in the next, well, let's see how long it takes. But here's hoping it's going to be less than 20 minutes. So we better get started fast. Number one, film. In your render settings right here, this little icon that most idiotically looks like a file folder as far as I'm concerned, I guess it's kind of supposed to be a DSLR camera. Kind of makes sense. It means render settings. Well, in your render settings, there's this little setting called film. And there's a little icon here called transparent. By default, it is not checked. So what, you say? I don't care. Well, actually, you're going to care, because when you go to render your scene, what you're going to discover is that even if you've selected a image output format that has an alpha channel like ping, which I did, it will not render the alpha channel. It'll put the world behind it. There may be a way to mitigate that in some other way by like deleting the world. As I recall, I think I tried that and it didn't work. So what I have found works, and so this is what I'm going to do, is go into your render settings, click the little drop down that says film. Why it's called film, I don't have a clue. And the option to make it transparent is right there. So there you go. So that's the first thing. All right, Blender 2.9. What's the second thing? All right, activate the 3D cursor. Okay, this is dumber than a box of rocks because we've had a 3D cursor, as you can see right here in the middle of the screen. There's two things different about the 3D cursor in Blender 2.9. Number one, clicking around the scene. Now, right now I'm in draw mode, so that's not really fair. So let me switch to object mode. Okay. In Blender, through all of history, if you click, it moves the 3D cursor. Well, not in Blender 2.9. What you need to do is click this little thing, then you can move the cursor around. So it's all good, and it's still Shift S to move the cursor to the world origin, which is a common thing to want to do, so that you can make sure new stuff that you create or add on your scene are being added exactly where you think they are. But there's one little problem, and the problem is that up here, see this little icon of overlays? Well, guess what? At least for me, by default, Blender 2.9 has this disabled, and quite literally, there was no 3D cursor. Not cool, but hey, I figured it out. So these, you want to look at these overlays and really see what all the options are, turn them on and off. And by the way, here's onion skin. I tend to not like onion skins. If you ever watch my channel, you know I'm not a big onion skin fan. However, what I've chosen to do with onion skins is leave them on, okay? But then when we go to our layers, I have them deactivated, which is this little icon right here, for every single one of my layers. That way the onion skin option is still there. There are circumstances where I need it, and I can just turn it on for the layer I need when it comes up. Okay, so that's onion skins. I'm actually ticking stuff off my list as we go. So that was activate the 3D cursor. Okay, so just a quick note about the toolbar. Let me go ahead and create a new scene here. By the way, if you change anything in your default scene and you want to save it, you do not save the defaults by hitting Control U like you did for the past 20 years in Blender. Nope. And this is true with Blender 2.8 Plus as well, actually, to be fair. But what you do is you go to File, Defaults, Save Startup File. So anytime you change something and you want to load another new scene where everything sort of starts out the way you like, you want to save your defaults, your startup file. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and create a new one. All right, so in Blender 2.9, I really like this toolbar, because this toolbar gives me instant access to my, sorry about that, my mouse went a little crazy, to my layers, to my pressure options on my stylus, my materials. There's my materials, and which brush I'm going to use. Now I tend to always use the same old pencil, but just a word to the wise, when I loaded my default Blender 2.8 template, that toolbar was not there, and I could not figure out how to get it to appear, actually. And I basically acquiesced and went with the 2D animation template, and I've just built out from there. And that's worked well for me. But I'm finding this is really cool because, and you have the same kind of thing in OpenTunes, actually, where you've sort of got instant access to all the most useful options at a moment's notice. Okay? All right. I made a note about removing erroneous brushes, which really should be erroneous materials. If you look at your materials, Blender 2.9 starts out with solid strokes and solid fill, which are quite useful. This is basically for lines. This is basically for solid areas of color or fills, right? And significantly, if you do a fill operation using the fill tool over here, and the material you have selected is a material that has a stroke but not a fill, then what it'll do is it'll actually just create a fill area that's just the outline. It's not gonna fill it with color. So be aware that the behavior of the fill tool is kind of dependent on the material that you've selected. Okay, so for me, the two other materials that sort of come default with Blender 2.9, I deleted, got rid of them just by hitting the little minus key here, because for me they're not particularly useful. The ones that are useful for me are something to draw with, something to draw solid areas of color with, which usually just becomes a template for other materials that are different specific colors, and then a shadow template which uses masking. Now these are the materials. In point of fact, these are the layers. So lines, shadows, details, fills. I'll explain those as we go along. But so okay, the next thing on my list is how palettes work. Now this is somewhat non-intuitive, but definitely very, very useful. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump. Okay, actually, while I'm thinking about it, okay, I'm going to mention something else right now because I'm bumping right into it. There's an option here called Auto Lock Inactive Layers. Highly recommend it, because I've always found in both Krita and Blender, it's really easy to just get into what you're doing and you're doodling along and realize that you put things in the wrong layer. Okay, so that is potentially problematic. But the other thing that's also problematic, in my opinion, is that if you don't auto lock your other layers, then the default behavior for Blender is, if I'm over here on frame 10 or 16, I guess is what this one is, and I start drawing and I create a keyframe here, Blender is going to add a keyframe for every single layer that is not locked. Okay, I believe if it's hidden, it's also protected from getting keys. But in Blender 2.79, I had a hotkey to isolate the current layer and or the current material, actually. Had different hotkeys for both of those. In Blender 2.9, it's kind of automatic. Just turn on auto lock and you're good to go. So that way you're always creating keys where you intended to. Okay, so now I've mentioned that. Okay, so the next point, coming back to it, is how palettes work. Let me show you. I'll just go into the fills layer here, and then we'll pull up the materials list here, even though we can also access it right here. Okay, so this is a little bit confusing, probably. Okay, this is a material that has both a stroke and a fill. So I'm going to go ahead and just create a cheese ball silhouette of some kind of character. Okay? Now, the feature here with palettes is the idea that you can have a single layer and a single material that actually accesses a lot of different colors. The problem is, if you go up here and you look at this, you see that nothing happens if you click here. So it's a little bit of a questionable interface strategy to have this brightly colored the way it is, but yet it's not clickable. But it is what it is. Here's the point. You have to select vertex color in order to access the palette. Okay, so you're either dealing with the default material that is in the slot right here, or at any point in time, you're dealing with the palette that's associated with. Frankly, I think the palette is associated with the material as opposed to being associated with the layer or the brush or anything like that. I'm not totally sure on that, but in practice, this is how it works. What I would do is switch to vertex color mode, and now I have the ability to actually add other areas of color. What just happened, by the way, ignore the man behind the curtain. I'll explain what just happened a second ago here in a minute. Okay, which means I can basically add little. I can deal with all kinds of different colors all in a single material without having to constantly switch between materials. Okay, so it's just like OpenToons in this regard. The difference in OpenToons between a Toons raster layer and a raster layer, the Toons raster layer is like the Blender materials. If you change the color after the fact, so let's go into material. See, this is, like I said, this is why it's a little confusing, is because this appears to be a material editor. Right now I'm on material setting, but I still can't change it. Okay, I have to go and do it here. So the thing about materials, as you can see, is you can change them after the fact, right? Whereas, this is important to understand, if you're going to go crazy with the palettes, have a good time, but be aware that there is no way to go back and change those colors after the fact. Okay, unless you do it sort of a kludgy way, like by selecting a different color and then doing a fill operation on this little zone. So you can do it, but it'd be a royal pain to do so. Okay, I mentioned the man behind the curtain. What I was talking about, and I'm going to put a check on my list here so I know I covered this. Okay, this is super useful, this right here. See that little icon? Draw strokes on back. That is really useful for when you're drawing a character. A lot of times, well, in earlier versions of Blender, if you're going to try to create zones of color with the grease pencil, you would really want to work from back to front. So whatever's the furthest behind, like someone's clothes, you would draw the shape of that first, and then you draw, say, the skin of their face over that, so that as you're drawing, you're just kind of piling on top the stuff that's coming forward towards the audience. In Blender 2.9, you don't actually have to do that. If you click this, any new stuff that you add is going to be added behind the stuff that came before. And I won't belabor it, but I will say that in practice, you will probably find this comes in really handy most of the time. So for me, it's the default. I leave this on by default. This other icon here is kind of important to be aware of. It's additive drawing. The reason it's important is I can add stuff to this frame, and as you can see, it's sort of animating as we go. If this is not on, then when I go to create a new keyframe, everything else gets erased and Blender assumes I want to start completely clean. Okay, so that's called additive drawing. It's always been there with the grease pencil, at least for the last many years, going back into the 2.5 series. But okay, one thing, this is just by the way, masking is coming up next. But first let me explain this. I changed the default eraser. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start a clean scene. And just, okay, so what I'm normally going to be doing is I'm going to be doodling along. Okay, and then if I'm doing kind of an inking approach, then I'm going to want to just tighten up my lines as I go. Just kind of like this. So I sort of I sketch it enough to where I can see it in my head, and then I'll just kind of delete those lines and you know, kind of tighten them up that way. It's not the only way to do it. Obviously, you could have a sketch layer and an ink layer. I've done it that way plenty of times. But we'll give this guy a big nose just because he's so happy. He's happy to have a big nose. But I didn't really like the default eraser, to tell you the truth. I would hit erase, and it would be like this really laborious, like you got to drag your mouse over it 75 times just to make everything disappear. So just be aware. I changed, let me click here. I changed the default eraser to be eraser paint. Is that eraser point? I can't even read that on my screen. But the default is, I believe, is this one. And this one, let me see. Nope, that's not it. Let's figure this out right now. I guess it'd be soft. Okay. So draw, and then it's like, okay. It's erasing more aggressively because of some things I went into the hotkeys and changed. So I can't even demonstrate the way it didn't work. But I will tell you this: if you haven't changed it in your Blender 2.9, then you've got that real soft brush. Anyway, I changed it to paint, either paint or point. I can't tell if that's an A or an E or an O, but that way, when I go to erase, by gum, it gets erased. Okay, so that's that. So we can go ahead and erase. Now, I tell you the truth, this would be my preference. My preference would be to draw a lasso, but as you can see, the tablet is a little fickle about the lasso, and part of the reason for that is the hotkey for that. So you're drawing, and then you have to hit Control Alt right mouse button. Okay, and I went through the Blender hotkey key mapping and really knocked myself out trying to figure out how to make it so that I draw, and then I either just hit the E key or just hit Control, and instead of erasing like this, I could draw a lasso to erase. I can't figure out how to do it. It appears that the hotkey system is a little bit tough to grok out, but what I think is happening is, and this is based on a bunch of experiments I did, is if you're drawing, when you hit Control, you're effectively changing what Blender calls the mode. Okay, so the action that's being carried out is still G pencil for grease pencil dot draw. Okay, G pencil dot draw. So if you turn that into a Python script, this is the action, the operator you would be invoking. Okay, so erasing and drawing both are this same action. The difference is that there's a mode associated with the action. And I think what's going on is when I hit Control right now to erase, and this is based on what I see in the hotkey setup and the various parameters, what's actually happening right now is you're being switched into erase mode. For me, it would be more intuitive if this icon lit up when you hit Control, and when you let go it jumps back to the pencil. It would be clearer to understand what's actually going on. Okay, but what's kind of strange about it is you can be in this mode, but now if I hit let's see here, if this is the test I did. I went ahead and switched to eraser mode so that I'm stuck in eraser mode as opposed to just draw mode. Then I was able to change the hotkeys so that Control Alt left mouse resulted in a lasso erase. Okay, so if I'm already in erase mode, I could switch it to my left mouse. But if I'm in draw mode and I hit Control to switch to erase mode, I could not for the life of me get it to accept the left mouse doing a lasso erase. So if you have some insight and know how to do that, by all means post something in the comments, because I'd love to know how to do it. I really would like to just be able to draw, and then hit Control and draw a lasso. It's just really quick, really intuitive, blah, blah, blah. Okay, did I mention onion skins? I almost said onion rings. As I said at the beginning, I've done this video twice, so I don't know if I mentioned this, so I'm going to mention it now. One of your overlays, besides the 3D cursor, which, by the way, remember, if you don't have that clicked, which it isn't by default, as I recall, you're not going to see your 3D cursor. But what I do is I take onion skins. I do leave them on, even though I hardly ever use them. And then what I do is I come over here and invoke these icons to turn on onion skins on a layer by layer basis as needed. So that's my take on onion skins. All right, so let's talk about masking. Masking is a big deal, and it's a big change actually from Blender 2.8. In 2.8, I'll just show you what would happen. Let's go to our skin material, because this is a typical use case. Would be I draw this silhouette of a character like so, and now I want to give him a shadow. Okay, so the shadow, I'll actually select the shadow material, and let me see if we got the yeah, that's a little. I think I have. Let me back up a little bit. Okay. So my material, I'm going to leave it on solid fill. I don't even think I need a shadow material, so I'm probably going to wind up deleting that, because it's really, the shadows are really a function of the layer, not the not so much the material. Okay. So there you can see what's happening. So I can draw the shadow area around here, and the masking is being invoked so that the shadow is locked to my character. So the question becomes, how do you do that? Well, in Blender 2.8, what you would do is your shadow layer, you would just turn on the masking icon like that, and any layers that were underneath your shadow layer in the stack would be the mask. They would act as the mask. So if the shadow layer in this case were below, like this in the stack, well, the masking is turned on, so it's looking for some other mask to cause it to know where to appear or not to appear. Now you might think it's strange that what I just did worked, and here's why. In Blender 2.8, all you had was masking based on stack order. In 2.9, it's different. In 2.9, you get this little drop down called masks, okay? And if you turn it off, no masks work at all, obviously, for that layer, okay? But then what you do is you add the layer that you want to have act as the mask. And it can be multiple layers, okay? But interestingly enough, and this is why I mentioned that it was kind of strange that this worked, this being mapped to this layer, so this is the mask, and then this is the layer that's being masked, okay? It still has to respect the stacking order. So if you have your shadow layer underneath the solid layer, you're not going to see anything. Unless obviously you turn off the masking, and then it shows up behind. So so you could look at it as theoretically this is actually working, because what it's doing is it's showing you, it's masking the shadow layer, but it just so happens that the stuff you want to see is actually there, but you can't see it because it's underneath the flesh tone, right? Makes sense? So long story short is, with masking, you need to set up the masking explicitly. It's not just based on the stacking order. And number two, you do still need to make sure that the layer that's being masked is above. Now I added this second masked layer called details, and what I use that for, this is just by way of demonstration, is it often comes up with clothes or something that you want to have like details, maybe some stripes or something, and this is a really simple way to achieve it. Okay, if we get on here to our fills layer, by contrast, you know, the masking puts everything on the inside, but this little icon I showed earlier keeps everything on the outside. So everything you need to sort of make what you're trying to make seems to be there. Pretty cool. All right. Well, the only other thing on my list has to do with creating materials. And then the question of why I always give solid materials a stroke. So I'm going to explain that right now. They're really two different questions, so let me just go through and explain this. So this is just a real quick procedure, because this is not totally intuitive right out of the gate. This is not actually a stack or a list of materials. It looks like it is, but it's not. What it is a stack of slots, and your material has to be inserted in the slot. Okay? So if you want to create a new material, generally speaking, my advice would be think in terms of starting with a material that already has most of the properties you want, maybe with the exception that it's the wrong color. Okay? Now for me, that's pretty simple because I really only have a stroke material for doodling and a solid fill material for doing solid fills. Okay? So here, if you want to create a new material, what you do is you first add a slot. Now you'll see it's empty. Okay, and you say, well, okay, I want to make a copy of the skin color. Okay, well, if you put skin in there, these are both pointing to the same data under the hood. Meaning, if you change this color, you're going to change them both. Okay, so what do? What you do is you create a slot, you assign the material that's pretty close to what you want, and then you click this to add a new material. And then it's generally well advised to give it a name as well. Okay? All right. Now, did I talk about palettes? Did I talk about palettes on this go around? I don't think I did. Okay, I'm going to give a real quick one. Real quick touching on palettes because I can't remember if I covered it. How are we doing on time? 26, we're doing okay. Okay, here's the deal on palettes. Everything about your materials works the same way you always thought it did in Blender, with one caveat. What if you want to have a single material and not have this stack get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger for every single color you're ever going to use? Okay, well, palettes solve that problem with one caveat. The caveat is this. All these colors that you put in the stack, as you know, can be changed anytime you want, just like that. Okay? And in the case of this guy's skin, as you can see, you can change your colors after the fact. That's one of the cool things about the material system in Blender. So the caveat about palettes is if you're going to go down the palette road, be aware that you lose that ability to procedurally change the colors downstream. So when you start laying down a bunch of color and painting and having all kinds of fun, you better make sure that the colors you're putting on the screen are in fact the colors you want, because it's kind of clunky to change them after the fact. You would have to go through and do a bunch of fill operations on the little zones of color to change them. Okay, so how do you use the palettes? Well, it's decidedly non-intuitive, because if you go to this little icon here, which is, let me try to get my mouse to stay still, active tool. Okay, number one, this is not grayed out, but yet you click it, nothing happens. Click, 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 nothing happens. Okay, you have to decide, am I going to work with the material or am I going to work with the vertex color, which ultimately translates into some kind of palette. Okay, if you're going to use the vertex colors, now you can go in and start tweaking and changing the color. I'll turn this off so I can actually overlap my new stuff. Okay, and frankly, the flexibility to do this is quite nice. I mean, there's a lot of painterly things that you could do in Blender that would have been a little bit clunkier to do before. And you don't have to have... Can you imagine having to have a new material slot for every single shade that you would ever draw? You know, it would become unwieldy really fast. And in fact, it did. Okay? So, but again, if you go back to the material here, there really is no way to change these colors after the fact that I'm aware of. If you click on these, it could be, I'm not going to go deep with this, okay? I'll just say this. It's a little non-intuitive to me. If I come over here and use the eyedropper, I would expect one of two things. Is if I'm in material mode, what I would hope would happen is it would actually select that material, which it really does not do. I'll come over here just to confirm that. What it actually does is, yeah, it's a bit strange. I'm not sure exactly what it's doing. I click on one of these miscellaneous colors. Okay, so this might be a clue for you. Okay, so that's kind of useful. So if I use the eyedropper to sample one of these colors that are the miscellany of the palette, it actually creates new materials. What's very strange about it is each of those new materials is only a stroke and not a fill. So that's a bit strange. I don't know why that would be. But let's copy this color over here, turn the alpha up, give it a fill property, and see what happens. Now the question for me would be, has this little item here been mapped to this color? I suspect not. And as you can see, it doesn't change color, so the answer would be no. So how that's like super useful, I'm still a little bit confused about. If I am in palette mode, okay, now this is interesting. Actually, the eyedropper itself has these options to be looking at materials or palettes. So I definitely want to grok this further, and you should too. Now what I expect will happen, let me see here, if I go back here, I think what's going to happen is if I sample one of these colors, I suppose I should probably be in vertex color mode as well, okay, and palette mode. And I think what it's going to do, it's either going to select this color or it's going to add a new color here at the bottom of the palette. So let's find out. Click. Okay, it added it. Okay, so now that's useful because now that is truly useful. Reason being that this gives me a way to very quickly, once I get back into drawing, I can very quickly get back the individual colors that I've used previously. So that means that I could use the palette mode, and if I have a set of colors that corresponds to a specific character, I could theoretically reuse that set of colors and only ever have to commit it all to one actual material slot. The key to that working, obviously, is making sure that the colors you're using are in fact the colors you want, because it becomes very clunky to change them later. Got it? Okay. The last thing I was going to say was, why do I always give my materials a stroke? Okay, so here, as you can see, this material, even though it's for filling areas or creating areas of solid color, I give it a stroke. When I turn the stroke on and off, you can see, if you look really closely right here, you can see that stroke appearing and disappearing. The reason I always give my fills a stroke is for this reason. Typically what happens is I'm going to take this character and now I'm going to maybe go into solid stroke mode, and let's say I'm going to give this guy some, you know, we'll assume I probably would color his eyes in white or something close to it, and he probably wouldn't have stripes on his chin. But what I would do is I would go in and draw these lines, and then I want to let Blender do the outline around the character. Okay? I don't want to have to either trace that, and I don't want to have to draw it and then use the fill tool. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I don't prefer it. Okay? So what I do prefer to do is take this layer, and now what I want to do is duplicate this layer. All right? That should be here, yes. So I'm going to duplicate the layer, and I'm going to drag it to the bottom of the stack, and then I'm going to go into my layer adjustments. I'm going to take its tint color, which is black, crank it all the way to 1, and then I'm going to change the stroke thickness on that layer and see what happens. Blender expands the stroke for that layer, and if my fill materials did not have a stroke characteristic, then it wouldn't work. All it would do is absolutely nothing. It would create a duplicate layer underneath that's black, but yet you can't see the outlines. So if you want to have magic outlines, then you need to make sure that your fill materials do have a stroke. So what I do in my case is I've got the basic solid fill material here that I use as a starting point, and then in this case these were actually just copies of this one using the slots technique I showed earlier. And that way, every time I ever create a new material, it has a stroke and is going to be suitable for creating auto magic outlines. The cool thing about the palette system, coming back to that for a minute, in my opinion, is in most cases this system is clean-ish. It's not as unwieldy as what we dealt with before. You could very well have a couple of your basic, materials, and then only a couple in many cases, but certainly not more than 3 or 4 or 5 materials for any given character, because you're able to have one material that uses a palette and give you a full range of colors without having to, what we used to have to do was, I can't even make this go small enough to demonstrate, but what we used to have to do is, scroll through dozens of colors, to get back to the one you want, which is a real pain in the butt. So, okay, that's it, guys. 35 minutes. Not too bad. It covers the things that I find interesting and useful about Blender 2.9, so this might be a harbinger of good things in the future, in the sense that I am indeed getting with the program and not being the Luddite that I've been for a long time, clinging tenaciously to Blender 2.79. It's going well so far. So anyway, with that, I will sign off, and as you know, there will be more.